All right, there we go. All right, so welcome to the sleeve class on fancy tubes and you. We're going to start with a project from the IKatBag blog, which I'll link to. It's linked in the handout that I gave to you here. And the first thing we're going to start with is an arm side. So this is roughly the shape of all the way around your arm. Humor me for a second and make an L with your dominant hand. And then take your thumb and stick it in your armpit with the pointed finger up. Okay. You feel how the front of your arm kind of has the same sort of shape as the webbing on your thumb?
Yes.
So when you think about an arm side, it isn't quite, especially high arm side, it isn't quite a complete egg shape. It's slightly, it comes out a little bit so that you can get over where the pectoral muscle goes into the shoulder here or is attached there. So you kind of have to allow for that a little bit for it to come out a little bit in the front. But the back is just kind of a very basic kind of curve. So you have your arm side. Now, for T-tunic, this will look really familiar, right? You'll have your giant rectangle. And we're going to roll up the giant rectangle. I'm going to stick it into the hole, right? Straight out at a 90-degree angle. Open up a little bit here. All right. So we've got our 90-degree angle, right? And that's a really big sleeve. And one of the ways that you can kind of bring down the giant circumference here is by adding gussets, right? Because that takes up part of the arm size circumference to make it smaller. But I'm just going to trace around this. And mark where it comes together underneath. So we've got our rectangle here. So that looks like a basic rectangle, right? Now, the trick with the gussets underneath the arm is the longer you make it front to back, the lower it tends to sit away from the body. And the lower away from the body you get, the more it can pull from there. And we'll go over like how the height of the arm's eye makes a difference as to what your mobility is, right? But next thing we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing again. This time we're going to tilt the sleeve instead of at a 90-degree angle, kind of at a soft sort of Y shape. So like not completely down at your side, but kind of close. And we're going this wrong way. Let me try that again. Patience is a virtue, right? Here we go. All right, we've got our rolled up roll. We're going to stick that back in the arm side again. And let it go. But this time, instead of at a 90-degree, we're going to put it at a slight angle. So kind of like there-ish. Not quite all the way down, but bisecting that tube a little bit more. And I'm going to do this one in blue, if I can get the lid off. Wow, the other one was so much bigger. Okay, so there we go.
Hey, assistant.
Here we go. All right. So we've got it at an angle. I'm throwing a cap on the ground. That's fine, whatever. And we're going to trace around where this bisects this tube. Like that. I'm going to mark where that is. And you can see here that tube is smaller now than what it was, right? All right. So you can see the original square. And we can now see the start of a soft kind of curve at the top and how much thinner that is this way than the square sleeve, right? And that you can kind of see the shape in like Elizabethan sleeves, where you see where it's it also, they usually have a built-in gusset, so it has one side of the sleeve that's here and the other side of the sleeve kind of copies that. so that you can just kind of lift up and go down. But that kind of shallow curve. That's why there's the shallow curve.
Is that the top of that curve, the armpit, or what?
Top of the curve is on the top of the arm here, right?
Okay.
And then the lower part is underneath the armpit, so that they get the under armpit. Now, a lot of sleeves have the seam here instead because it makes it easier to go around the elbow. And two-part sleeves are a different monster, but as far as why this shape happens, that's what we're getting into. But yeah, you can, with a lot of Elizabethan sleeves, one of the things that you'll notice is that it has what looks like two upper sleeves. They're basically the same sort of shape, and they both have that kind of hump to it. And what that is that's giving you a little bit of extra room for when you have your arms up.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a regular gusset that's a square gusset, except it's more like a football. But rather than cutting out a football shape, it's just incorporated into the sleeve pattern.
Okay.
All right, so that's not that important right this second. All right, so we've made our tube. I'm going to stick this in here again. But this time I'm going to shove it down as far as, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to take my cap off first. I'm going to be smart this time. Take off the cap while I have two hands. Woo! All right, there we go. This time in green. We've got our tight little tube. We're going to stick this into our arm's eye as flat as we possibly can down against the body. So this is going to be as steep as possible this way. Right? Trace around that. Yeah. All right. Now you see how much smaller that sleeve is, right? As far as the circumference goes.
Mm-hmm.
The blue is out here, the red is out here, and the green is all the way back here. You see how tall that sleeve head is?
Yeah.
And that's why, basically. So now, if you're putting a sleeve on someone who has a bigger bicep ratio to their arm side, you might want to consider to do the shallower sleeve head. So if you have someone like, I don't know, who's built like The Rock or whatever, even if you're doing a sleeve that is like even a suit sort of sleeve or a coat hardie, as close to the body as possible, you might want to cheat it up a little bit to get that wider bicep without curving out for the bicep. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that's basically why sleeves are shaped like that. It's because you're bisecting that too at different angles. All right. So there's that. Let's talk. I'm going to grab the lid for this that I tossed on a second ago. Okay. So next up, I'm going to screen share, and we're going to some of the most common fitting issues for sleeves. Let's see here. Share screen. Desktop. Okay. There we go. All right. So this is the handout that I shared the link to. You'll have access to that for as long as you want. Let's talk sleeve shape or sleeve fitting first. So some of the wrinkles that you run into and how to read them. And see what the problems are for that. And then we'll go into what are some of the most common sleeve shapes through SCA timeline, right? Not including antiquity, just because I was lazy, didn't include antiquity. So let's start with this. This is one of the most unintuitive fitting issues that you'll run into right here. Just so you know what the slides are looking at, more or less. On the right, I provided what it looks like when it fits really well. And on the left, I tried to include a bunch of oh no's. Now, I didn't, the main reason why these are modern pictures is because I don't want to put any reenactors on blast for no good reason.
Yeah, good job.
They're hard. And looking at historical stuff, you can't just look at someone and be like, ah, yes, well, that obviously doesn't fit the way they meant it to, because that might be the fashion of it. So yeah, so these are modern guys. We're going to look at a whole bunch of famous people's poorly set sleeves, or just random people. But anyway, so this is sometimes called a shark bite. It's unintuitive because the problem is not really the sleeve. Where the problem is across the center back of the shoulder blades. Because basically, if you think about it, it means that the edge of the shoulder is not far enough out to be able to skim the outside of the arm without a poof, if that makes sense. So to fix this, what you do is you let out your center back of your coat or your waffen rock or whatever, right? To get to there, to get rid of this funny little divot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what we're looking at here is a pitch issue. Now these are extreme. For the most part, you're probably not going to run into wrinkles as strong as this, but it can help with understanding where the arm sits, right? So everyone has a slightly different pitch to their arm. And by pitch, I mean how far forward does their arm naturally sit or bend, right? Or back, for that matter. Like where it sits on the arc of where arms can hang. And for here, you can kind of see where it's pulling at the front of the sleeve here, whereas arm is that much more forward here than back of the sleeve. And that's why you're getting the pulling here. Same with this one. This one's too far back. Now, granted, he's just standing weird, but if you see this with someone standing relaxed, that's what the issue is. So basically how you'd fix this is you would pop the top of the sleeve head off of the sleeve of your mock-up or you're testing, whatever, and then you would treat it like you're driving a car. And you're going to kind of tilt it back and forth like a steering wheel until the wrinkles go away. Now, if you don't necessarily have the person there, after you're setting in a sleeve and you want to make sure that you absolutely have the pitch right, one trick that I really like doing is taking a safety pin or thread marking right where their arm hits in the front of it, right? So if their hand hits right here, I'd put a pin in right at the front of their sleeve on the coat itself, right, or the coat hardie or whatever you're making. And that way, when you have it on hanger or form or whatever, you can just turn the sleeve until it lines up a little bit in front of that pin, and you know that you have the right pitch. All right, these are circumferential issues here. So if you see the lines that are pulling straight across, right, that basically means it's too thin in the circumference. So you can see, like, this guy is not a small guy. He doesn't have small biceps, right? But that's hangs quite smoothly down rather than pulling straight across. Like this guy, it's too small across the forearm, it's too small at the bicep, but I mean, that is kind of the look. I'm fairly certain he meant it to look like that because, yeah, it looks like he's going to Hulk out of his jacket, which is the point. But for the most part, that's not the look that you're really looking for, and unless you have elastomers in your fabric, which weren't really used until the 40s, which is way out of period anyway, or you have it on the bias, like it's uncomfortable and I wouldn't recommend it. So for the most part, that's what those wrinkles mean. Let's see, we already covered pitch. I should delete that one before. Okay, so this one is an issue with the sleeve head itself. So you see how you get these kind of smiley lines that are kind of pulling just, or frowning here, where it's kind of pulling across the front, from front to back. So this means that the sleeve head is too thin front to back. So it's not necessarily that the sleeve itself, the circumference of it is too small, because if you look here, like that's not too tight on his arm, it's too tight on his front to back shoulder, right? Because it's trying to say that your arm is only this thin when his body is not. So that's where you start getting those kinds of things. And what you do is you just make the sleeve head fatter at the top, or wider. Yeah?
Yes, yes.
Okay, all right. So Sleeve length is very subjective. One of the great things about period sleeves is that vary greatly in length. It is very interesting to look at exactly when I am paying attention to the computer, therefore the cat must require pets right here. Anyway, so when you're trying to hit an era exactly, paying attention to where it hits in period is really useful. And this is one of those things that people who really understand that particular era will absolutely geek out over, and people who know more about sewing and less about historical accuracy may freak out over, right? Like if you see something from like the 1330s where the sleeve hits well above where the bone is on the wrist, if you have more experience with sewing than with historical accuracy, you might look at that and go, oh no, the sleeve is the wrong length. When you look at pictures of the period, though, you're like, oh, that's a great period detail. So it is one of those things to keep in mind that sleeve length isn't universal. It's worth looking at. All right, so remember when I promised we'd talk about arm size and how closer the arm size is, the better the movement. It's kind of like trousers, right? If you have trousers that don't fit at the crotch and at the fork, where your legs come together, basically, they'll rip out more likely, right? The lower it is away from your body, the more likely it is going to cause you problems and stop your movement. And you can see these in some wonderful presidential sleeves here, that the difference between some of our older presidents, which have very high arm size, so if they're very close to the body of the person, you can see how they can raise their hands and wave, which is also one of the nice things about presidents, is that they wave and show off that, hey, my sleeves can do this. Or in case of more modern presidents who put in significantly more shoulder pads, which makes it much harder to have high fit arm size. We also have a thing of, we went from more people being able to afford custom-made suits to only the absolute elite getting custom-made suits. And to get a sleeve's arm size to fit that well and that closely, you do kind of have to have it custom-made. So we as a nation were like, no, we no longer want presidents with suits that look good, apparently. You can kind of see here where how low that arm size is. Like that's practically like underbust nearly here. And you see how when he raises his arms, he gets a break in the chest of his suit. It's the same sort of thing. Like if you've ever fought in a shirt and like practically ripped the arm off, it's probably because the arm size is too low. Which is where you kind of get into the issue of if you want a thinner sleeve with a gusset, right? If you're doing the rectangular construction, then having a bigger gusset will make it so that you can have a thinner sleeve, but it does mean that the arm size is going to sit a little bit lower. So you have to be kind of, that's the balance that you're making and the trade-off that you're making. So it's fabric consumption to fit in the arm, to fit in the arm size. Okay, so we've talked about fit. Let's talk about sleeve shapes and period, because that's fun, right? All right, so we have, so more or less these are the main, some of these I have photos from a book that's also linked in the handout that has great sleeve shapes from extant sleeves that you can look at. And what I've done is I've analyzed them as to where the arm's eye is on the sleeve pattern as opposed to where it would be on a person. And these are the main points, more or less, on a human, the circumferences and the length. And we're going to go over that. Now, this is all for woven sleeves. I did not go into knit sleeves. Knit sleeves are a whole other kettle of worms, which are covered in the blog that I was talking about earlier, that I got the whole stick tube into hole project from, IKatBag. She explains sleeves really, really well. If you want the 2.0 version to the like master's level degree, go there, read her stuff. She explains knit sleeves really well too, which they're a whole other kettle of fish. So anyway, let's talk about some period sleeves. So as far as the sleeve shape goes, you can see where some of the fit is here, and where you can run into multiple different sleeve shapes. In this middle one right here, I love this one because you have wide short sleeves, thin short long sleeves, sleeves that hit kind of midway, and that's really helpful and useful, right? You have sleeves with very low arm size, you have sleeves with very high arm size, and I mean, yeah, this is 100 years worth of sleeves on this slide, mind you, but for the most part, like, being able to say that anything they absolutely did it just this one way is tough, right? There are more likely ways, and there are ways that we have examples of. But even like today, where you have 5 tailors and you ask them how to make something, you'll get 7 answers, right? And that's just the way humans work, especially with sewing. We don't really codify an exact explanation as to this is the one way to make this for sewing. But you can see some of the variety and some of the decoration, which is very cool. This is, next 50 years. You can see how you can add fullness in different places too. Like a lot of these, you have a very tight arm size and the softer sleeves up here, and some very nice wrinkles to be able to read from. Some lower arm size, especially in upper class kind of stuff, as well as some extant garments. I kind of love how floppy this one is, and you can kind of see where the wrinkles are pulling, and that can help inform the grain line and all that jazz. I'll go over more grain line and stuff in the Reading Wrinkles class for tomorrow, which I'll also be recording, so you can always look at that later too. From this, here's another 100 years in a chunk, right? But here you can see like the fullness of the elbows getting bigger and so forth, but also a variety, right? You have wider sleeves, you have thinner sleeves, even in the same portrait. And where it hits on the arm, see how much wrist you can see here? That makes a big difference, right? Like not having it all the way down is something that is a period thing to do, right? And you start getting some of the crazy sleeves too, the angel wing sleeves and the over sleeves, and both men and women. All right, so speaking of extant things with extant patterns, so you can see here where it has this little bitty gusset. But the shape of the sleeve, one of the things that you can do to limit the amount of fabric that you're using is to taper the sleeve in to get to the wrist, which is where you're seeing a lot of the sleeve shapes from before here, where it's tight on the forearm. Look at how much wrist bone is showing. She would get docked points at a state fair, most likely, for the sleeve not being the right length. Sensibilities are not necessarily historical sensibilities. But you can kind of see how that is reflected in the sleeve shape and how it fits into the body as well. Where if you're saving fabric by tapering it in to get to the wrist with little bitty gores instead of bigger gores, that can make a difference. You get some really cool elbow shapes in the 1270s when they start to shape the sleeves even more. And you get some interesting, like, this will probably look familiar as far as the kind of softly sloping arm's eye with the sleeves sitting kind of at a Y angle, and some very steep arm size that sit much further out from the body. Now, one of the things to be said about that super high arm's eye, what color was it? Was it green? It was green. Where we did the super tall arm's eye, right? Some of that is formed by gores and gussets in these as well, but part of it is that those tend to be outer garments more so than inner garments, right? Even in the Victorian era, you run into shirt sleeves that are sewn in the T-tunic kind of way with gussets underneath the arms, but rectangular construction. And then the further out of the layers you go, the steeper the arm's eye can be, partially because you're building up on the shoulder a little bit. So if you're looking at outer garments, more likely to have a tall arm's eye, inner garments, more likely to be square. But all generalizations, including that one, are false. So, of course, to the rule. But you start getting some really cool elbow shapes, some very ingenious use of bias as well, which maybe we should go a little bit into grain line. How much do you know about grain line and why you use it and why it's important?
I understand that.
Okay, cool. Then we'll just skip that. Tomorrow anyway. That we already talked about. So this is a picture from the actual blog. You should check it out. It's awesome. All right. So you get into the 1280s and so forth, and you still have a lot of that, a lot of wrist showing. You're getting more and more wrist showing. Although there's variety, of course, going down. The poofy soft sleeves, poofy soft elbows. This is one that's a very soft construction, and it just keeps the fullness down to the wrist. So as far as not tapering it, that's more or less what it looks like in person and what the pattern would look like. And you see the undershirt here where you get that heavily tapered sleeve, and same with these extant Spanish dresses with the really cool freaking elbows. Look at that elbow. Isn't that, like, not that I'm incredibly biased or anything, but cool elbows really get me. So for the Moy dress here, you can see here that this is getting into the Grand Assiette sort of sleeves. So the dinner plate sleeves that are moving the arm's eye further in on the body so that you can use more of the fabric's bias and so forth in the places that you move the most. So, gores across shoulder blades and small ones in the front for ease of movement. And so the arm's eye here is actually further in on the sleeve. And you still have a little bit of elbow taper and so forth, and it gets even more extreme the later on we get. But it is ingenious. The use of bias and so forth is ingenious. I love plaids because they tend to show off what the grain line is. It's very useful to see how the sleeves are fit. Once again, more wrist than you would necessarily think. Fairly soft elbows. You still see some fairly high arm size, but with the softer, wider upper sleeves. And you start seeing all of these very tight lower arms where there's only so far that you can tighten the sleeve down without lacing it or having a closure. And so why not show some wealth in there too? Have some pretty buttons. All right, so 1330s, 1340s, you get some really funky kind of like duck-shaped sleeves. I love those. And more of the, like, if you saw that, like that pointed sleeve shape on someone at an SCA event, wouldn't you look at that and be like, that's gotta be fantasy, right? But yeah, here it is, off of a brass rubbing, go figure. Whole lot of wrist here, none wrist there, but still with the kind of soft elbows, especially in the more conservative kind of areas. This also varies quite a bit by location as well, but I didn't bother going into that since we're going so far into like decades here. 1340s, more and more buttons. And look at those elbows. Tighter and tighter sleeves, and so you're going to see more and more curved sleeve heads. Here's probably one of the most famous Grand Assiette sleeves. You'll see these on the battlefield all the time, partially because they are super comfortable. They're some of my favorite sleeves because they don't get in your way. They're super comfortable. They wear kind of like a t-shirt, and most of us are used to wearing t-shirts, so you figure. Lots and lots of buttons, very closely fit, and when you have a straight arm, the elbow kind of pops out to get that tight of a fit over the sleeve. And as far as pitch goes, that also kind of, it might be indicative of someone who has stronger biceps and triceps as well, if their arm naturally stays more bent, which may or may not be true. That's reading a little far into it. Maybe more fashion than anything else. 1370s, you have still a lot of the cool Grand Assiette sleeves, some of which look kind of like little hoodies. It's kind of cute. And you also have some of the plain arm's eyes. You run into still quite a few where it's the shallow sort of arm's eye here, shallow sort of arm's eye there, buttons so tight and all the way up. Like, it's getting extreme, which that's fun. More Grand Assiette stuff. Ooh, all right, so 1380s. There is this short fad for really giant elbows, and I love them. I love them so much. They're so quirky and weird, and you don't see them pretty much any other time. There's a small revival of it later too, but for the most part, like, that's 1380 sleeves. They have those crazy things. So a lot of Grand Assiette sleeves that you see, some just plain set in arm's eyes as well, and longer over the hand sleeves coming into fashion as well. 1390s, you still have a lot of Grand Assiette. You tend not to see the crazy elbows anymore, but still some softness in the upper arm. All right, so let's talk about some of the extant sleeve shapes. And you can see here how different some of these sleeve heads are. Some of them are much steeper than others. Some of them are shallower than others. Some of them are almost Grand Assiette. Some of them are rectangular in their construction. But for the most part, you see how it has the sleeve head on the top, and then the seam goes down the back of the arm, which is very useful if you're adapting this to like an angel wing sleeve to get it to hang right too. Okay, 1410s, you're getting some more pinned on sleeves. Still some echoes of the Grand Assiette sleeve here. You get the angel wing sleeves. If you want those to hang correctly, you want the seam going down the back of your arm. Cynthia Virtue's website has a really good analysis of that, and I think, if I recall correctly, you get cool baggy sleeves on top of things as well. All right. No, I went too far. There we go. So 1460s to 1500. We're going a little faster now because the sleeves are getting more boring. You get a little bit of Grand Assiette sleeves, especially in Holy Roman Empire. You get some really crazy, like, basic tubes that are tied together. You still have, some fairly shallow sleeve heads and wider sleeves, especially in working garments and overgarments. But there are some really beautiful sleeves. Once you start getting into the Tudor stuff, you get tighter upper sleeve, bigger bells, which is kind of cool. You have this little short stint of those very poofed upper arms for a little while as well. And remember what I was talking about, how upper sleeves and lower sleeves look very similar in the Elizabethan era?
Mm-hmm.
Here you go. This is this is from a Spanish patterning book. And you can see here that the undersleeve and the oversleeve look basically identical. The oversleeve is slightly bigger, which makes sense because it hides the seam a little bit better and it sits better on the arm. Mostly because the under part of your arm, it just takes up a little bit less room. Not a lot of it, but a little bit. If you cut them exactly identical, it's not going to be the end of the world. But yeah, but you can kind of tell when you cut these out and lay them over each other that which one's the oversleeve, which one's the undersleeve. But they both have that kind of extra gusset for extra reach. And those set in kind of like this. And you see how far off the shoulder this is here. And that helps shorten that sleeve head as well a bit. And we get some really cool sleeve shapes in the Elizabethan era as well. But you can see here, this is the unfinished sleeve that has that sort of soft sort of sleeve head. This one has a very high sleeve head though, so your mileage may vary. All right, so I'm gonna stop the stop the screen sharing here. All right, so what questions do you have as far as sleeves go? I know you have some questions that you brought with you with the with your book and so forth. Does that make sense, the stuff that I went over? And
yeah, it makes sense.
good stuff.
I think I need to do the thing. I need to do the thing. Make it so that I understand it.
Yeah. Being able to follow along and do your own tubes helps.
Yeah.
And taking pictures of the sleeve that you're working on helps a lot too. Because then you can look at it a little bit more objectively of what are those wrinkles doing and where does this actually fit. And also in fabric, when you're doing a mock-up, if you do a quick out of cheap material, like old sheet, whatever, cloth, and then you put it on and let it sit and warm up to your body temperature. Especially if it's a cotton or linen, it'll wrinkle, and you can follow the wrinkles and it'll tell you more or less what's wrong.
Let me try.
Yourself, though. You can get it if you can get a hand with it. That like it's worth it to try.
The beginning with the fitting issues, that's awesome.
Oh, good.
knowing what to do. Sorry, let me find this to show you what I was trying to make.
Yay, pictures!
Sorry. I haven't looked at this in months either because I was all fired up to get my garb together. And I had a list of things, and then quarantine happened, and I had to homeschool my kids and lost motivation, all that.
Oh, I hear you there. Like,
Oh.
if you survive this, you win.
Oh,
In my opinion, anyway, right? Like, this is, it's hard. It is very hard.
it is. And there's going to be people who have really amazing garb when we come out of this. But
That
we
is
don't have to garb because some people will have the time to do it.
Yeah. I mean, time and motivation. Like, some people, that's their coping mechanism is, I don't feel good, therefore I'm going to make it.
Mm-hmm.
That'll make me feel good.
Okay, I found it. Sorry, it was
Cool.
not.
No worries.
Let's see if I can get this up here. If it's going to focus.
Oh, sure.
Okay, so I don't know how to fit, because that's not a curve. Like the back of this dress is, it's a rectangle that has the triangular gores, right?
Yep.
So then how, there is no curve on the back of the sleeve, it's like a straight sleeve. I don't understand how to make the sleeve.
All right. So what does the pattern look like as far as, I didn't quite catch, I'll hold it up again for the pattern of the sleeves.
It's so blurry.
It is, but I think I get the general gist. So I think that's looking at a slightly modified rectangular construction. So it does taper in a little bit at the wrist.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So as far as getting it to fit exactly like that, it doesn't have a terribly steep arm side, which should make it kind of soft around your bicep, which should be nice and comfortable. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you can always, if you, do you know how to like radial draft that into a bigger thing, or even just like count out this is supposed to be this big and making it roughly your size from that? Or would you rather, you can drape there? Okay, so there are three main kinds of patterning. There's draping, drafting, and flat patterning, which is getting into more than you necessarily need to know about sleeves. But basically what I'm trying to get at is there are multiple ways of tackling that if you want it to look like that.
Mm-hmm.
So it has the pattern in there. One of the things that you could do is you could draft the pattern to be just like it, basically, except your size.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can take the ratio up based off of whatever fits. If you assume that the wrist fits, you can kind of blow it up from there as far as the ratio goes. If this is 1/10 of the size of your wrist, you can then just multiply the rest of the measurements by 10 and you'll end up with a sleeve that's the same sort of sleeve, but big enough to put on a person.
Right.
Now, pretty much any pattern that you're working with that was made for someone else is probably not going to fit you perfectly the first try, just because humans are all different. Every single one. Like, the reason why fit models make so much money is because they're one of the only ones that's close enough to an average size that they can test clothes on them. Yeah, nobody's average. So take that with a grain of salt. There's also, if you want to take your measurements and how much bigger you want it to be, if you want it to be, and go from there and draft it out of my arm is this long. So I'm going to do it from here to there. And then my bicep is this wide. And I want it to be a little bit wider than that here, but I want it to fit fully at the wrist. And not be able to get your hand through. So one of the things that you want to keep in mind is if you have no closure at the wrist, you need to make it so that it's big enough that you can stick your duck hand through.
Right.
So as small as you can kind of do this, you can do that as a measurement. You can also, if you're working with a fabric that has a little bit of ease, and most fabric does, right? If you're cutting it on the straighter grain, the cross grain will have a little bit of ease. You can sew it with a back stitch that gives it just enough give that you can get it to be
Okay.
just small enough to get over that. If you want a very tightly fitted forearm, I'm not sure if that's the style you're going for. It looks a little bit more like the later period, like however you pronounce it, Lortel Salter or something like that. But the kind of wider, softer sleeve.
Yeah.
Which is something that you see a lot more in stuff that if you're going to be running around and like doing crafts in camp, that might be more comfortable.
Yeah, wrestling children and washing my hands repeatedly and all of that. Yes.
Exactly. Or if you have a bigger wrist measurement too, you can shove up your sleeves. Because my main experience with children is that they are sticky.
Yes, this is true.
That may just be my nieces and nephews, but yeah. Yeah, so that's one of those things that you want to weigh for what you're using it for and what balancing out who you're who would have worn it and why, and what you're going to wear it for and why, and balance out the whole period accuracy to practicality as well. You're not going to run into. I'm not going to judge anybody for as long as they're trying. I don't. I do think it's cool when I see stuff that's like, yeah, I raised my own sheet to do this, and I, that's cool. That's very, very cool.
Yeah.
I don't get it wrong, but at the same time, like, nobody in period would have done that. Nope. That's a uniquely modern thing to do, is to be like, all right, I'm going to raise the sheep, and then I'm going to weave it. Well, I'm going to spin it, and then I'm going to weave it, and then I'm going to sew it, and it's going to be awesome, and it is. And that's as close as possible as we can get to historical accuracy, and yet the process itself is not. So yeah, we can't do 100% historical accuracy anyway. So not that I see any reason to be mean to people about it anyway, is my philosophy in general. But yeah. That's a rant for another day, I suppose.
Right.
But yeah, all right. So let's see. So we covered drafting. Flat patterning is more or less taking a sleeve that you know fits, and then kind of altering it to make it look like what you want. So if you have like an old shirt that you like the fit of the sleeve, that you know it fits on your arm and it's comfortable, that you don't mind cutting up and just like flattening down, and then like I don't know, making the arms eye a little bit flatter and a little bit wider at the top, or cutting into gores. That's flat patterning. And then there's draping, which is taking fabric and throwing it at a three-dimensional form until it looks right. And usually people do a mixture of all three. People tend to like one more than the other. It's kind of like geometry and algebra. Like, people tend to have preferences, but yeah. Once you're fitting it though with some scrap fabric, that can make a lot of information. Yeah.
I have it all cut out, and I just haven't put it together yet. I'll do that part.
It's good stuff. Well, I hope it'll go real smoothly, and but feel free to pick my brain if you put it on and are like, why is it doing this? Okay. Because I like getting my brain picked. It helps it keep cleaner.
Yeah, sure. I have your contact info now, so.
True. You know how to find me.
Awesome.
All right. Well, we still have like 10 minutes. Apparently I talked too fast. That's okay. You'll forgive me, I'm sure.
Everything was it's all very interesting. You could have taken more time. The sleeves and all the pictures and everything was very cool, so it wasn't boring.
Good.
If you didn't go to the let's move on. No. It was very interesting.
I try for not boring.
Good.
Granted, I think everything's interesting, so it's hard to judge sometimes.
Right? Seriously.
All right, let's see. Yeah, I put that there. So you've got the link to all of the links and stuff. You can contact me. Do you want to call it a day?
Yeah, thank you. I printed out your handout, so I have that.
Well, thank you for coming.
Hey,
It makes it a little more fun than just talking to a screen.
for sure. Thanks for re-hosting.
Oh, yeah. It's my pleasure. It keeps me out of trouble.
Awesome. Go find that cat. I bet he's in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.